I am so pleased that we've managed to get two of maybe the best people positioned to speak to us about some of these issues joining us as presenters and discussants. We have from the Kissinger Institute on China and US, and China and the United States, the director with us, Rob Daly, and I will leave it to Leland to introduce him for me because I understand that they have relations going back a long time. And on my right here with us in Barbados is our very own Dr. Antonio Aline from the university's Department of Economics, who will be, I think, bringing it home, right? And thinking about, from an economic perspective at least, some of the implications of that deal on the Caribbean. We at the SRC have contributed in our modest way to the discussion. Here in the room with me is one of our trade researchers, Ms. Chelsea Brathwaite, who's in the background here, who's written a piece which we called The Art of the US-China Trade Deal. It looks at some of our ideas about what the implications of that deal may be, and we would invite you to read it after this discussion sort of excites you to learn more about the deal. And obviously, we also have people in the Caribbean who are writing. One of our MITP researchers is right here, Ms. Daika Straker. She's also written on the topic of China. So we at the SRC have been making our contribution to the debate. But for today, we're really here to listen at the feet of some of the experts in the field. And without further ado, let me allow the deputy of the, I believe he's the Deputy Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy, Mr. Leland Lazarus, to do the honors of introducing our presenter today, Mr. Rob Daly. Thank you so much, Mr. Daly, but I'll turn it over to Leland to do the introduction.
Jan, thank you so much. And it is a distinct honor to introduce my friend and mentor, Robert Daly. We met all the way back in, I think, 2015, is that right? In Beijing. And you've been a good mentor ever since. Robert Daly is the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He has served as a U.S. diplomat in Beijing and as an interpreter for Chinese and U.S. leaders, including President Jimmy Carter and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And as head of China programs when he was head of China programs at Johns Hopkins, Syracuse, and the University of Maryland. And he was a producer of Chinese language version of Sesame Street. He's recognized in the East and the West as a leading authority on Sino-US relations. He has testified before Congress, lectured widely in both countries, and regularly offers analysis for top media outlets. So without further ado, let us welcome Robert Daly.
Thank you, Leland, and thanks to all of you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks for coming out or joining us remotely if that's what you're doing. I've been looking forward to this discussion for some time, and I look forward to continuing it after today's session if there are opportunities. I wanted to emphasize right at the beginning that although I have been a diplomat, I am not speaking for the US government today, but I'm speaking as an independent analyst. As you no doubt know, there's an ongoing debate, strong disagreements in Washington about what direction American China policy should take. And just so that you can orient yourselves within that discussion, I would probably be considered the rather more moderate end of the scale with the way that things are in Washington now, but I'll leave that to you to judge. We came here today to talk primarily about the trade war, but I think we all have to begin by admitting that the trade war, this topic seems almost quaint right now compared to the coronavirus. If we had met about the trade war several months ago, we would have been talking about the economic impacts of the trade war on China, on the United States, whether these back and forth tariffs were tilting the world perhaps toward a global recession. But of course, now the losses that come about because of the coronavirus in China and in the US and worldwide certainly dwarf those of the trade war and are likely to continue to grow. So this is moving quickly. And so I'd like to begin by wishing all of you good health, and also good health, of course, to the people of China, Barbados, the United States, and around the world. This COVID-19 could potentially have some bright sides looking down the road, including things like teaching all of us, and especially teaching our governments, a little bit of humility before the forces of nature. And also, one would hope that a global pandemic would remind the world, but Washington and Beijing in particular, of the need to work together to meet issues that cross borders. So this could be an occasion to focus on humility and cooperation. But we're not doing very well with that. Neither Beijing nor Washington is doing well with that. There is, I think, a very ugly series of accusations going back now between the two nations about who is to blame for this, what its origin was, who should apologize to whom. And I think it gets in the way of our cooperation. And so why is it that in the midst of this pandemic, we're seeing such sort of angry, accusatory attitudes from the capitals of these two powers? And I think the answer to that question is fairly clear. We have entered a new era in US-China relations. Xi Jinping, the chairman of the Communist Party of China, likes to speak about new eras. And I think in this case, it really is a new era. And in the relationship, this is going to be an era that is characterized by long-term worldwide competition between the United States and China to shape security architectures, trade and investment regimes, very importantly, the development, marketization, and regulation of new technologies, but also norms and practices and their underlying values systems. That competition between the US and China, which doesn't have to preclude cooperation, that competition, I think, will be a major geostrategic factor for all of us, no matter where our countries are located, for the rest of our lives, and probably for our children's lives as well. It is a high stakes competition between mutually distrustful powers. The roots of this turn from the engagement that characterized US-China relations for the first 40 years to a more rivalrous relationship now, the roots of this run fairly deep. This did not begin with Xi Jinping or with Donald Trump. I think that in the main, competition is a historical, structural development. But I think that it became clear to people that we were in a new era, sort of in two phases. The first was in 2016 with China's build out of man-made islands in the South China Sea. The Permanent Court of Arbitration then found that really none of China's claims to historic rights or other sorts of rights in the South China Sea had any merit under international law, and China ignored the claim. That was one phase in global realization we're in a new era. And then the second phase, when it became undeniable that this was a new era, really did begin when President Trump imposed the first tranche of tariffs on China. And that was about 2 years ago. Question then, and this is a question that I think probably led to today's meeting. When we signed what is called a phase 1 trade deal on January 15th of 2020, did President Trump end the trade war that he had started by cutting a deal with China? This is the way that it was popularly portrayed, I think, in the press. I'd be interested to hear how it was portrayed in Barbados. But the notion, again, Trump ended it, cut a deal, he started a trade war, he ended it. Is that right? Actually, I think that characterization is wrong on a number of grounds. First, I would argue that, in fact, President Trump did not start the trade war. I say this as one who is actually quite critical of administration policies in a number of areas, but I think that the Trump administration is correct when it points out that actually we were, before the first tariffs went in place, we were long overdue for a major adjustment in US-China economic relations. That was overdue, regardless of what you think of the tariffs. Why was it overdue? Well, obviously the background of this is China's rapid development, what is usually called the rise of China. And the next thing I say, I want to be very, very clear about, because I'm going to be offering a number of cautionary notes with reference to China and its economic power. So I want to be very clear that in the main, China's rise, the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty on a scale and at a speed that has never been seen before, is a very good thing. It is a good thing for humankind. It is a major accomplishment. You know, the great improvements in the well-being of 1/5 of humankind is to be celebrated. And I want to make very clear that is how I feel about that aspect of it. However, it is also clear that after 2013, China's gradual movement toward more reform and openness slowed and has essentially stopped in China. China moved away from the path of economic reform on its own terms, not economic reform as defined by America, but China moved away from economic reform as it had been defined by the Chinese themselves, in fact, including by Xi Jinping. And at the same time, we have seen, and I think that this is a demonstrable fact, increasing repression at home within China and increasing assertiveness worldwide, which is part of what has conditioned the American response. And so when I say that the economic relationship was long overdue for a readjustment, I'm talking here about certain Chinese economic practices which the United States and other nations, not just the United States, but many other nations have objected to for decades. So China had heard these complaints. And I'm talking about the fact that China's economy is still relatively closed. China's economy is relatively closed. There are major problems with China's treatment of intellectual property, which don't meet with global norms and global practices. There are also a great many non-tariff barriers to foreign investment within China, barriers that don't exist in other countries. So China takes advantage of other countries, of conditions that it doesn't extend to those countries on their own terms. China also has aspects of China's industrial policy. And what I mean here is China's subsidies for its massive state-owned enterprises. Aspects of that support for state-owned enterprises are a violation of China's WTO agreements and create unfair conditions for competition. And then lastly, there's a general lack of reciprocity within the Chinese economy, and this extends to things like media and NGOs as well. So these are long-standing issues that, again, China's own economists understand. China has recognized that most of these issues, with the exception of intellectual property, are issues, but has been saying for the past several decades that it was involved in a gradual development of reform to address these. This question about the changes in China, here in Washington, one of the forms that this takes is that there is a debate about whether China should be regarded as a developing country or not, and whether it should receive special allowances or exemptions or different kinds of treatment for being a developing country, as it has, really since 1979. And I think there's a bipartisan consensus, Democrats and Republicans in Washington. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but there's been a shift toward consensus here, that China is not a developing country. Are there a lot of poor people in China? Yes, absolutely. And we should all wish that they continue to do better. There are also a great many poor people here in the United States. Having a lot of poor people in your country is not the standard for being a developing country. So I propose to you that there are two reasons that China should not be treated as a developing country, despite its ongoing problems with poverty. One is that China has, by far, and the gap is growing, the world's largest middle class or consumer class. And what that means is that China, in addition to being the world's biggest trading nation, also becomes tastemaker to the world on both the supply and demand ends. That is not a feature of a developing nation. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly in geostrategic terms, it is true that there's a lot more wealth in the United States than in China. And I have some colleagues who say, GDP and GDP growth really isn't an important measure of a country's national strength. It should be the wealth in that nation. I disagree with that. You should know I'm not an economist. I'm a politics and culture guy, but I disagree with that for the following reason. It's true that there is a lot more wealth in the United States than in China, but most of that wealth is in the hands of the 1%. And the American government cannot tap that wealth for national purposes. Whereas in China, because of the nature of the Chinese government, the Chinese, Beijing can put a much higher percentage of its national resources at the service of strategic goals than can the United States. And the number of poor people that you have is immaterial from that point of view, or from the point of view of the world's largest middle class making you the tastemaker to the world. And so Beijing still insists that it's a developing country, but I think that it gets increasingly not much of a hearing on that one. And then add to that, when we look at US-China relations broadly and the trade war, obviously China's increase in power makes an enormous difference. China is learning to leverage its wealth to meet geostrategic ends and is increasingly able to shape economic and other factors in other countries to meet its goals. So naturally, we are paying attention. The United States has played, I think, an invaluable role in China's reform and development. America has made an enormous contribution over the past 40 years. Yes, this is sometimes overstated by the United States. China's development, China's fantastic economic success is not due to the United States. That's way overstated. It's due to the very hard work of the Chinese people. But the United States has played a big role in China's reform and development. The issue geostrategically is that reform and development is now understood, I would argue, properly. We used to see reform and development as being about the welfare of the Chinese people and China's integration into the international system. We now see, and you can look at Xi Jinping and other leaders' actual speeches to demonstrate this, that reform and development in China is understood as instrumental to the buildup of China's global power and influence. Okay? We therefore have to ask, what is the nature of China's power? What does it aim at? And that's not something that we ask because we are hegemons who want to defend our status. It's simple self-interest. China's power means that it has a stronger impact on all of us. You feel it there as well. Some of this is positive, right? Some of these are opportunities. But it would be foolish of us not to ask questions about the nature of Chinese power. In the Caribbean, you have long been compelled to be students and critics of American power. You're very skeptical about the nature of American power and America's claims about our own virtues and the benefits of working with Americans. You're skeptical of this for reasons of self-interest. You need to be critical and skeptical. And what I want to suggest to you today is that you increasingly need to be equally critical and skeptical of China's own claims about the meaning of its power and its goals. And I think that that's one of the, I'd be happy to hear your views on that, but I think that that's one of the big takeaways today. So, did Trump end economic tensions? No, of course the Phase 1 trade deal does not really alter the nature of US-China competition. Trump didn't begin this, he can't stop it. And that is in part, as I've mentioned, this is not merely a trade war. This is a multifaceted competition, and Beijing knows this as well as Washington does. This is, US and China are engaged in a global competition for a new form of preeminence. I don't think there will ever be a nation that's preeminent in the way the United States was at the end of the Cold War again. There isn't going to be any one indispensable power, but the United States and China are competing to be the most influential shaper of global norms and practices. So those are the stakes of the trade war. And because that's true, because the stakes are so large, and this is a long-term competition, the Phase 1 trade deal, while notable, isn't that important. So I want to go through what I think we've learned from the trade war experience so far and the deal itself. What have we learned? One, Beijing cannot satisfy the demands of the American administration, particularly with reference to what I've called the structural issues. They cannot satisfy the demand that they stop subsidizing state-owned enterprises. Why is that true? in my long experience with China, and I say this as one who is very critical of the Communist Party in many ways, nevertheless, I think that the Chinese Communist Party sincerely believes, and many Chinese people support that, they believe that because China is so vast, so large, so complex, and unevenly developed, only a strong authoritarian central government can provide the stability that is needed for further development. Whether or not I agree with that, I think the government really believes that. And part of that is support for state-owned enterprises. This is not something that the Chinese government can take out of its governance. It's actually central to its governance. And believing what it does, if the Chinese government simply stopped supporting state-owned enterprises from its own point of view, and again, I want to make clear, I'm not necessarily signing on to this, but we have to understand the Chinese point of view. To stop supporting state-owned enterprises, the Chinese government thinks it would actually be failing in its moral obligation to the Chinese people to provide more development. That's what they believe. So when we look at these structural issues, and this again is one of the major messages I'd like to suggest to you as you continue to evaluate these issues going forward. The real question regarding structural issues should not be framed in terms of the US-China trade war. Okay, these questions about in China's industrial policy, made in China 2025, support for state-owned enterprises. That's not, whether that changes is not a function of US-China negotiations. It is a function of whether China decides to get back on the path of reform for its own purposes. That's what's going to affect a change here. America can nudge, and American policy, yes, should be to encourage China to get back on the path to reform, which is in fact what many Chinese leaders and economists, probably including Liu He, all want. And yes, the United States and its diplomacy should also be encouraging other countries to push China back onto the path of reform. But that decision will be made primarily for Chinese domestic reasons and not under pressure from the US. Second lesson, technology and industrial policy, innovation, are now really very much at the heart of the matter and the heart of US-China relations. This is new. Both sides agree that innovation, the mastery, the leadership of 5G systems, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, all of this henceforth is going to be the key to what China calls comprehensive national power, which means hard power, economic power, soft power, normative power. Innovation matters greatly, and that realization is causing changes and rethinks here in the United States, even about whether we should have an industrial policy, which Senator Rubio of Florida, a Republican, is now advocating for. So that's a major change. Another lesson of the trade war, there is a values component to all this. There is an ideological component. And I think in some ways, this is the heart of the matter. US-China disagreements aren't really just about who's going to be the hegemon. The two nations really do have different models in relative terms, not absolute terms. We agree on a great deal. But we have different models of how to be human. The Chinese government's model is that we are all, in the Latin phrase, homo economicus. We are economic beings. And human beings just need to be satisfied materially, technologically, and to have good outcomes in terms of health and education. And then they're happy, they're satisfied, that's it. So government is to provide those things. That's not only a Chinese model, but it's primarily a Chinese model. On the American side, there's a different model of what human flourishing is and what the economy and the government should provide. And it comes out really of the models of the Enlightenment. You may have read in university about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you begin with just physiological needs, which have to be satisfied. Then the need for safety, or what China would call security or stability. And these are fundamental. Any government seeks to provide these. But then you get to, once those are satisfied, human beings discover three other levels of needs. Maslow said the first is love and belonging, then esteem, and then self-actualization. I actually think that there's an easier way to think about it, and that is FDR's Four Freedoms, which he announced in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said that humans have freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. So freedom from want and freedom from fear, those are basically the physiological and safety needs. And that's what the Chinese government puts forward as the sum of needs. So the question, I think, for other nations, including yours, as you look at Chinese models and Western models, you have to ask yourself not only about things like infrastructure needs, which are very important, no question, and China is offering a lot of lending for these, but you also have to ask about what your model is. Do your people also seek things like freedom of speech, freedom of worship, Maslow's higher level of needs? That's part of what this disagreement is actually about. So tech is at the forefront, and I would argue that American concerns about Chinese tech, some of them, are well founded. The sort of the poster child for the nature of our concerns is something like the solar panel industry. And the way this works, broad strokes, is this. You have a technology which was largely developed in the West, which China then embraced for very good reasons of self-interest, as provide energy as well as global warming. But China, by protecting and subsidizing its industries, is able to produce solar panels on a massive scale at very low costs, and then sell them worldwide below cost to dominate the market. And when that happens, not only does that mean that other countries can't compete because our industries are not protected and subsidized in the same way, there's something actually worse than that in the long run. And we see this with solar panels. It freezes the further development of the technology. It disincentivizes further innovation. And so these are the kinds of concerns that we have about Chinese technology. And that is why, and this is another lesson of the trade war, that is why China essentially has lost the support of American businesses. American businesses through the 80s, 90s, the first decade of this century were big supporters for integration with China. They lobbied to get China into the WTO. They actually pushed it over I don't know if I can use a football analogy, soccer. Anyway, they made this happen in Washington, but they don't support China anymore in the same way, and that is why. Leland, how are we doing on time?
We're good. You have a good 5 to 10 minutes? Yep.
Okay, so a few more lessons, I think, if we look at the experience of the trade war so far. I think it has to be admitted that China has been more certain of its strategies, of its goals, its capabilities, what it was and wasn't willing to do than the United States. China has I think, somewhat clearer foreign policy goals. And I'll tell you how I understand Chinese foreign policy goals. You may disagree. China seeks a world that is highly integrated. It's very serious about that. This serves China's interests. China seeks a world that is highly integrated and wholly accepting of the prerogatives of the Chinese Communist Party. So you sort of hear in that, there's sort of a positive and a negative side to that. Again, highly integrated, yes, but wholly accepting of the prerogatives of the Communist Party. So the question becomes, well, what are those prerogatives? Broadly speaking, I think the formula of Chinese foreign policy is to build deference through dependence. I think that's the simplest way to think about it, to build deference through dependence. Now notice that China, I think, seeks deference, which is different from dominance. Okay, so I don't see China as being analogous to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that wants to export, ideology and dominate countries in quite the same way. No, this is not the Third Reich looking for Lebensraum. Deference means no obstacles to the prerogatives or goals of China as defined by the Communist Party. So it's deference, getting deference through dependence. And I think that China, because it was fairly clear about its goals in the trade war, mostly sort of stuck to its guns. There's another cultural factor that I think we saw at play, and that will probably come back again. China has a very complicated, very violent recent history, not only invasion by Japan, but civil war, but then all of the Maoist, Mao Zedong campaigns that killed tens of millions of Chinese people. And because of that, the Chinese national virtue that they're very proud of, and I think they're actually correct about, is what they call 吃苦, the ability to eat bitterness, the ability to take it. So it was very clear at the beginning of the trade war and throughout the trade war that not only the Chinese government, but the Chinese people felt that if this came down to a competition of privation between the American people and the Chinese people, a competition of who could endure more suffering, the Chinese were pretty sure they were going to win that one, right? So they had a sense, a common culture and a sense of where they were going that I think served them well. China, I think also, and this goes way back in Chinese history, China is very good at using the factor of time in diplomacy. They're very good at the play for time, the phasing of problems, strategic stalling, the play for time to allow for the changing of conditions. They're very good at using time in diplomacy. The United States is not as good at that. Because we come from a highly legalistic culture, our approach tends to be to push for agreement to rules and adherence to rules. We want diplomacy to be about that. We want a rules-based order, rules that are clear, public, that can be disputed in agreed upon courts through agreed upon mechanisms. We think that that's the way to go. China doesn't work in quite the same way. In fact, it's one of the other, I think it's a ironclad rule for understanding China's diplomacy and even its approach to global governance. And it's this: China doesn't propose rules. It creates conditions. China says that it's not, that it doesn't want to overthrow the international system. It wants to improve it. And I think that there are some ways in which that's very true. China's compliant with a great many agreements that it's been part of. Not only has it been compliant, it's actually improved some of these systems. I think it's too sweeping to simply say it's a revisionist power. But when China says it wants to improve the system, a rules-based system says to China, okay, propose a rule. Propose a rule in the form of a rule that is going to apply equally to all nations and benefit all nations. And China does that sometimes, but tends not to. It creates conditions, again, by leveraging its power. And it's very effective at that. It's very effective at that. And we saw that, I think, during the trade war period before the phase one deal. And then lastly, the last lesson of the phase one trade deal. I don't think it does anything to diminish uncertainty. So what this means for you and for people all over the world and for Americans and for Chinese is that this trade deal is at most a pause, a timeout, although I think it's not even that. And uncertainty has not gone down in US-China relations. And I think with the coronavirus and the handling of that, if anything, certainty, including certainty about global trade and investment regimes, has perhaps gone up. Let me then just lastly, I always over-prepare, I've got too much. We can get to some of this in Q&A. The agreement itself, I think, was signed primarily, and I think this is well understood, because of President Trump's domestic political concerns. It looked as though moving forward with additional tariffs or even continuing the tariffs that were already in place would hurt lower income Americans especially, and might even possibly be recessionary. One of the lessons of that is that China in general has a pretty good read on American domestic political factors. And this is because our domestic politics is open. We're an open book. You can read the same things in the morning papers that I can. Our politics, even when it's sloppy and unseemly and highly democratic, it all happens in the broad light of day. And so it's no surprise that China has a better read on our politics than we have on Chinese politics, which remains hidden and largely secret. And so because American domestic politics drove the phase one trade agreement, it was an agreement to some extent, although there are exceptions to this, on China's terms. China did what it's always done, is it made some purchases and it made some promises. And it made promises for purchases, sometimes promising the same purchases it's promised before. But they nevertheless managed to fend off an increase in tariffs by purchases and promises. China also got two other things that it wanted very much. It got a phased process for further discussions. Again, time and the factor of time. And it also got the Trump administration to agree to a dialogue mechanism Okay, we used to have dialogue mechanisms in place, the strategic and economic dialogue. The Trump administration came in very skeptical of that. Now they've agreed in theory to a new dialogue mechanism, although we don't know what that means. So when I say this, I don't mean that a phased process and dialogue is necessarily bad, but it's something that China had wanted. At the same time, President Trump can also claim some real victories. I think that he can fairly say that he achieved more along these lines than any of his predecessors. That's very important. He brought more toughness to the table. He created leverage. He created awareness. And he put pressure on China that none of his predecessors had done. And those forms of pressure won't go away. He can pull those back out of his pocket if he wants to. So I think that he can claim, not to get a perfect best ever phase 1 trade deal with China, no. But to have brought more attention to a vital new issue than any of his predecessors, yes, I think he can claim that. And he also changed minds of mainstream economists and even many people in the expert community. When the trade war started, most American economists said to the president that your theory of trade is wrong. Trade deficits with individual countries don't really matter. The theory of trade demands that you have a balance of trade in all of your trade worldwide. It doesn't demand a balance with each individual country. And so at the beginning of the trade war, the common critique of the Trump administration was trade deficits don't matter in the way you say, therefore tariffs are the wrong tool. Having watched this from Washington, I can tell you that President Trump changed a lot of minds about that. And an awful lot of people who began as critics ended up saying, well, you're still not exactly right about trade deficits, but you found leverage and you got China's attention in a way that nobody else did. And that is a very good thing. So we are in a pause of sorts because of the phase 1 trade deal. And I think that the coronavirus and then the American election and ongoing issues in China are now dominating the dialogue, such that the trade war as such is really on a back burner in the news cycle here in Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was riveting for me, and I'm sure for the audience, in terms of understanding the agreement as a sort of crystallization or concretization of some of the geopolitical and ideological bents of these two countries. In a way, I feel like you're saying we're making a big deal about the deal, but in fact, all it is it represents a sort of a hardening in some ways of some of the positions that have always underlined, the approach of the United States or the approach of China, in the sense that it still leaves, as you were explaining, for some of the Chinese approach of a more phased dialogue approach, and this is actually inculcated now in the agreement. It lays out a process now for increased dialogue between these two countries, and I wonder if, when we get to the Q&A, I'm gonna put a little nugget of an idea for you to come back on is, so we know what's happening in terms of this deal with the US and China, but obviously it has had, whether in actual impact or more in terms of the soundings, it's having an effect on all of these other countries.
Yes,
absolutely. Right? In some ways, you're seeing the United States and China at war at the WTO because of the positions they're taking, and schizophrenically, they're coming up with this deal on the side. What do other countries, including CARICOM countries, make of that, especially when there's very little wiggle room for us to say, hey, this deal is affecting us, but you guys try to get your act together in all fora, the WTO outside. So I'm just gonna kind of leave that little nugget to ponder on whilst we ask the discussant who we have with us, who I think as an economist is going to bring to the fore some of the questions that we still have lingering about the economic impact, if any, of this deal on the Caribbean economies. So I realize that you're saying a lot about what happened in terms of, forcing the Chinese to buy more goods and, you know, President Trump bringing more focus to trade deficit as a consequence of trade deals. That's really interesting and important. But what's happening to the CARICOM economies? I mean, has anything changed as a result of the deal? Is it really just more of a political issue, as you so greatly outlined in your presentation? So I think we have a wonderful opportunity. As an economist is sitting next to me, and you're an IR person. I think we have all of the different, you know, perspectives that are going to be on the table now. So I'm just going to hand over now to Dr. Aline to take us through his view of some of the economic impact of the deal, and then we'll open up the discussion more widely. So thank you, Dr. Aline.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion. Hi, Robert. I like your speech. So I'll begin with one of your main comments as it relates to the deal itself. I do believe that you're correct when you say that it's just a pause in this long-term war that between U.S. and China, because the real issue comes from the political aspect, the negotiations are in terms of discussing politics and so on. So, which is not my field, but my comment here today would be to focus on the economics of things going forward. Now, before we do that, again, I would like to mention one other thing as it relates to the deal itself. Now, there are three aspects as it relates to the deal: reduction in tariffs, improvements in the environment for U.S. companies within China, as well as the mechanism of dispute resolutions. Right? So, as that outlined in the document, there are about 50 or so, from what I saw, 50 or so different mentions of China shall do something as it relates to the U.S. 10 or less than 10, actually, I think about 9 or so, of what the U.S. should do. Now, we talk about fair trade and fair and balance of trade and so on. So how would you see this playing out? That's a question for you as it relates to the overall picture, because I see it as, you know, maybe, as you said, a temporary pause, but at the end of the day, there are some serious tensions that are still there. So tensions that are there actually borne out by this new agreement. Additionally, you talked about it may just be for the political environment at the time being, as it relates to the new elections coming up and so on. Now, regardless of that, do you see this as a correction to the damage that have been done before as it relates to this to the trade war going forward? Right, because the U.S. itself has had to pump, I think, billions of dollars into the agriculture and manufacturing sector to prop them up, and businesses have been falling.
Agriculture especially, yeah.
Yeah, agriculture especially. And with China, the information is difficult to find. But I do agree with you, it seems to be a waiting game for the Chinese, right? Now, specifically to the agreement, the impact for me goes way beyond just the China and US's borders, because everything that China agrees to, from my perspective, comes at the expense of some other country. Because to actually take up or to fulfill another $200 billion worth of goods within a 2-year span seems quite challenging, particularly with the new environment going on, the new dispensation with the coronavirus and so on. And that obviously has taken quite a toll on the demand and supply of the international trade environment. Right? So these things are quite critical. However, for me, from a perspective of the Caribbean, though, I don't see, unlike some of the larger players, I don't see this having a major impact per se from an economic perspective. When we talk about trade and the impact on trade, you may see, however, some diversions as it relates to trade, because analyzing the data going forward, right? I saw that during the period end of 2017, 2018, I don't have data for 2019 as yet, but data trade has declined with the Chinese during this period, and there was a shift. Well, I was a shift of that trade towards the U.S. So our exports from within the CARICOM region have shifted more so within those two sectors, agriculture and manufacturing have shifted away from China towards the U.S. So even though there is a shift, we have not made any or not faced any significant losses towards within this new environment. We have been experiencing declines, speaking from on the ground now in this year due to the coronavirus, but the data does not suggest that there would be any significant losses towards the Caribbean itself from an economic trade only perspective, right? So my question to you is, again, could this deal actually hold, right? Because we're facing serious concerns as it relates to the issues of supply and demand within the international trade environment, but tensions still continue to build up as it relates to China and the US. And that is of our more greater concern, I think, more from a political perspective as opposed to economic perspective. Our trade, I must say, is significantly small that we are not hindered at this point from any major trade declines overall. So trade has balanced back out from a shift from China towards the US. It has, however, may have caused some political contention or drawback for our countries on the periphery, but I don't really see it as a major issue for the Caribbean itself. Right. So some interesting facts, though, I've come across. Now, as Dan was hinting at before, I do realize, and I do agree with her, as it relates to the trade agreement itself. This bilateral agreement that has been going on between China and the US now, doesn't that impact the WTO's multilateral system and therefore cause some worry for persons or countries within smaller islands when it comes to negotiation of trade? Because we're moving away now from what I will call already weakening WTO's agenda, right? And if two of the larger powers decided, well, we're going to go against that, how does that affect other countries on the periphery looking in, particularly small developing countries like ourselves, right? I see that not playing out too well in the future, but we don't know at this point in time, right? So that is obviously, for me, one of the bigger concerns going forward. Additionally, I mentioned the asymmetric level of information or requirements, put it that way, as it relates to the agreement. China obviously is more heavily weighted than the US in terms of the US benefiting more than, we put it that way. So particularly with the area of technology. Now, you've mentioned that in particular industry, technological industry, China is now giving away to some of the US demands within the agreement, right? So doesn't this signal to the rest of the world that given that we now have, that Chinese have the US's approval on development of technology, will this signal some negative spin-off or drawback for the US towards in relation to the development of technology and so on? Because if you're giving the approval that China can also provide this technology at a quality level based on your standards, wouldn't this impact the US's overall industry, right? And overall, to deal, despite the assurance of the market, I personally think that we don't know exactly where things will go right now. Part one of the deal is just maybe the beginning. So whether you decide or you feel that it is the beginning of the end of the China trade war, or it is just a stopgap, I don't think you can outright say what it is right now or the repercussions of it, given the limited amount of information we have going forward. Because to be honest, China is somewhat of a closed box when it comes to information, right?
Sorry, China is somewhat of a what?
Closed box. In other words, it holds this information quite tight. It's very difficult to seek information that relates to that. So I can't really model, or it'd be difficult for anyone to model or make any assumptions on how things will go, what their intentions are, as opposed to what the US says its intentions are as well. It is. So that is basically my 2 cents. I leave you to basically address those couple of questions as I pose them to you. But for me, I can say directly with the Caribbean itself, I don't foresee any major implications as it relates to phase one of the deal. Phase one of the deal, like I said, the most I've seen with the data is there's been some margin of trade diversion away from China towards the US, because there was a pattern of growth indicated prior to 2017-18. So the data have now shifted, or exports have now shifted back towards the US within these two sectors. But our limited exports towards the US could not really help the US during such difficult times.